Ethan Carter's soccer ball sailed through the air with more force than he intended, and his heart sank as it disappeared over the tall wooden fence into the neighbor's yard. A yard he had only ever seen glimpses of through the cracks in the slats. The house next door had always seemed like something out of a ghost story. The paint on the shutters was peeling, the lawn was overgrown, and the windows were always shut tight, the curtains drawn. Everyone in the neighborhood knew it belonged to Mrs. Willow, an elderly widow who rarely came outside. Ethan, like most kids on the block, had always kept his distance, but now his soccer ball was in her garden, and there was no way around it. He couldn't just leave it there. It was his only ball, and his mom couldn't afford to buy him another one any time. Soon, he wiped his hands on his jeans and glanced nervously at the house. "Mom," he called into his own house as he stood in the doorway. "My ball's next door. Can I go get it?" His mother, Claire, poked her head out of the kitchen, where she was chopping vegetables for dinner. "Next door? Into Mrs. Willow's yard?" She frowned. "Just be polite, okay? If she lets you in, don't wander around. And if she says no, you let it go. Got it?" Ethan nodded, although his stomach was already twisting into knots. It wasn't like he wanted to talk to her. She was known for being grouchy. But he had no choice. The walk to her front door felt longer than it should have. He hesitated on the porch, staring at the weathered doorbell. It looked like it hadn't been used in years. Taking a deep breath, Ethan knocked instead. It took a full minute before the door creaked open, just wide enough for an elderly woman's face to appear. Her thick glasses magnified her sharp gray eyes, and her lips were pressed into a thin, skeptical line. "Yes?" she asked, her voice low and raspy. Ethan shifted awkwardly on the porch. Hi. I'm Ethan. I live next door. My, soccer ball landed in your garden. Can I go get it?" Mrs. Willow stared at him for a long moment, as if deciding whether or not to slam the door in his face. Finally, she sighed and opened it a little wider. "You didn't trample my flowers, did you?" "I don't think so," Ethan said quickly. "I didn't mean to." "Fine," she interrupted. "Come on then, let's get this over with." Ethan followed her through the house, which smelled faintly of lavender and dust. The furniture was old but neatly arranged, and the walls were lined with photographs in ornate frames. He didn't have a chance to look closely before they reached the back door, which Mrs. Willow opened with some difficulty. The garden wasn't what Ethan had expected. Instead of rows of flowers or neatly trimmed bushes, it was a tangle of weeds and wild growth. The soccer ball sat in the middle of it, nestled against a broken flower pot. "There it is," Mrs. Willow said, gesturing with her cane. "Go on." Ethan hurried to retrieve the ball, careful to step over the plants. As he picked it up, he couldn't help but notice how neglected the garden looked. The weeds were so thick that they were choking out the patches of daisies and tulips struggling to survive. He turned back to Mrs. Willow, who was leaning on her cane, watching him with a raised eyebrow. Mrs. Willow?" he asked hesitantly. "What is it now?" she said, sounding more tired than annoyed. "Your garden. It looks like it could use some help. I mean, if you want, I could maybe help you clean it up?" Her eyes narrowed. "What do you know about gardening, boy?" "Not much," Ethan admitted, "but I could pull weeds and stuff. It's the least I can do since I messed up your flower pot." Mrs. Willow looked at him for so long that he thought for sure she was going to send him away. But then, to his surprise, she chuckled softly. "Well, I suppose it's not like you could make it any worse. Fine. Let's see if you're more useful than you look." Ethan grinned, clutching his soccer ball. "Really, I can start now if you want." She waved him off. "Not today. Come back tomorrow after school, and don't be late. I don't have all day to wait around for you." "Okay," Ethan said quickly. "I will. Thank you, Mrs. Willow." She muttered something under her breath, and shuffled back toward the house, but Ethan thought he saw the faintest hint of a smile as she closed the door behind her. As he walked home, he couldn't help but feel proud of himself. He wasn't sure why Mrs. Willow had agreed to let him help, but he was glad she had. Maybe she wasn't as scary as everyone thought. When he told his mom what had happened, she raised an eyebrow but didn't say much. "Just be careful," she said. "And don't forget your homework." "I won't," Ethan promised. That night, as he lay in bed, he thought about Mrs. Willow and her overgrown garden. He wondered why she let it get so wild. Maybe she just couldn't take care of it anymore. Or maybe she didn't care. Either way, he was determined to make it look better. It wasn't like he had much else to do after school, and Mrs. Willow seemed like she could use the help. For the first time in a long while, Ethan felt like he had something to look forward to. The next afternoon, Ethan hurried home from school, his backpack bouncing against his shoulders as he ran up the front steps. He tossed his bag by the door and grabbed a granola bar from the kitchen. Heading next door, he called out to his mom, who was folding laundry on the couch. "Don't forget, dinner's at 6, Claire replied without looking up. "I'll be back," Ethan promised, already halfway out the door. The sun hung low in the sky as he crossed the short distance between his house and Mrs. Willow's. Her garden gate creaked loudly as he pushed it open, and he spotted her sitting on an old wooden bench near the back door, her cane leaning against her knee. "You're on time," she remarked as he approached, though her sharp tone was softened by the faintest hint of approval in her expression. "I was beginning to think you'd forgotten." "Of course not," Ethan said, smiling. He dropped his soccer ball on the ground and rubbed his hands together. "Where should I start?" Mrs. Willow gestured toward a patch of weeds overtaking a corner of the garden. "Those things have been trying to take over since spring. If you can manage to pull them out by the roots, maybe I'll believe you're serious about helping." Ethan nodded eagerly and got to work. The weeds were stubborn, their roots tangled deep in the soil, but he didn't mind. He liked the rhythm of it, pull, tug, toss, and the way the air smelled of earth and grass. Every now and then he glanced over at Mrs. Willow, who was watching him with a mix of amusement and curiosity. "You're not bad at this," she said after a while. "Thanks. It's kind of fun," Ethan admitted, brushing dirt off his hands. Mrs. Willow raised an eyebrow. "Fun? You must be easily entertained." Ethan grinned, but he didn't respond. Instead, he turned his attention back to the weeds, determined to clear the entire patch before he left. As the afternoon wore on, the two of them began to talk. At first, it was just small comments, Mrs. Willow pointing out which plants were worth saving, and Ethan asking questions about the garden. But gradually, the conversation deepened. "So, why do you live alone?" Ethan asked hesitantly, immediately wondering if he'd overstepped. Mrs. Willow didn't seem offended, though. She sighed and leaned back against the bench, her cane resting in her lap. "My husband passed away years ago," she said quietly. "We never had children. And, well, most of my friends have either moved away or, you know." Ethan nodded, unsure what to say. He couldn't imagine what it would be like to live without family or friends around. "What about you?" she asked suddenly, her eyes narrowing as she studied him. "Don't you have friends to play with? Or is this garden your new idea of fun?" Ethan flushed. "I have friends," he said quickly, then hesitated. "Well, sort of. I mean, there are kids at school I hang out with sometimes. But, I don't know, it's not the same." Mrs. Willow tilted her head. "Not the same as what?" Ethan shrugged, pulling at a particularly stubborn weed. "They're just not real friends, you know? Like, they're nice when I'm around, but they don't really care if I'm there or not." For a moment, Mrs. Willow didn't respond. Then, she said, almost to herself, "That's a lonely feeling." Ethan glanced up at her, surprised by the softness in her voice. "But," she added briskly, "you're young. You'll figure it out. And until you do, you've got this garden to keep you busy." Ethan laughed. "Yeah, I guess so." By the time he finished clearing the patch of weeds, the sun was beginning to set, casting the garden in a warm, golden light. Mrs. Willow stood slowly, leaning heavily on her cane. "You did a decent job," she said, nodding toward the cleared section of soil. "Better than I expected." "Thanks," Ethan said, wiping the sweat from his forehead. "Do you want me to come back tomorrow?" Mrs. Willow hesitated, her gaze flickering to the garden and then back to him. "If you're not too busy with your sort of friends," she said dryly. Ethan grinned. "I'll be here." "Good." She turned and started toward the house, then paused at the door. "Oh, and Ethan?" "Yeah?" "Next time bring gloves. Your hands are filthy." Ethan laughed as she disappeared inside, and he headed home with a spring in his step. The next few days followed a similar routine. After school, Ethan would head to Mrs. Willow's house and spend a couple of hours working in the garden. First, their conversations were sporadic, but as they grew more comfortable with each other, they began to share more about their lives. Ethan learned that Mrs. Willow had been a school teacher before she retired, and she told him stories about the students who had made her laugh and the ones who had made her pull her hair out. In turn, Ethan told her about his classes and how math was his least favorite subject. "You're probably just not trying hard enough," she said one afternoon, handing him a glass of lemonade. "I try," Ethan protested. "It's just boring." Mrs. Willow chuckled. "Boring, huh? Well, maybe if you spent less time kicking that soccer ball and more time studying, you'd find it less boring." Ethan rolled his eyes, but couldn't help smiling. One day, as they were finishing up for the afternoon, Mrs. Willow mentioned that she loved crossword puzzles, but had trouble seeing the small print. That evening, Ethan rode his bike to the store and spent his allowance on a large print puzzle book. When he handed it to her the next day, Mrs. Willow stared at it for a long moment before saying, "You didn't have to do this." "I wanted to," Ethan said simply. She nodded, her expression unreadable. "Well, thank you." As the weeks passed, the garden began to transform. The weeds were gone, the flowers were blooming again, and the air seemed lighter, as if the whole place was breathing a little easier. And so was Mrs. Willow. Though she still had her sharp tongue and dry humor, Ethan noticed that she smiled more often now, and her laugh, when it came, was warm and genuine. For the first time in years, she didn't feel quite so alone. 2 months had passed, and the garden was nearly unrecognizable. The once wild and untamed space was now a colorful patchwork of blooming flowers, neatly trimmed bushes, and soft, inviting pathways. Mrs. Willow's gruff exterior had softened as well, though she remained quick with her sharp-witted remarks whenever Ethan teased her about her perfectionism. For Ethan, the garden had become a second home, a place where he felt both useful and appreciated. One chilly afternoon, the sky heavy with clouds, Ethan arrived at Mrs. Willow's house to find the door slightly ajar. It was unusual. Mrs. Willow was always meticulous about locking up. He hesitated for a moment, then knocked lightly. "Mrs. Willow? It's me, Ethan," he called. There was no response. Concern prickled at him, and he pushed the door open wider. The house was silent, save for the faint sound of the wind rattling the windows. He stepped inside cautiously, his sneakers squeaking on the polished wood floor. "Mrs. Willow?" he called again, his voice louder this time. A weak reply came from the living room. "In here, Ethan." He hurried toward the sound and found Mrs. Willow sitting in her armchair, her cane leaning against the side. Her face was pale, and her usual sharp gaze was clouded with exhaustion. She tried to smile when she saw him, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Are you okay?" Ethan asked, his heart pounding as he crouched beside her. "Just a bit under. The weather," she said, brushing off his concern with a wave of her hand. "Nothing to fuss over." "You look really tired," Ethan said, frowning. "Have you eaten anything today?" Mrs. Willow hesitated, and the pause was enough to confirm his suspicion. "Okay, that's it," Ethan said, standing up. "I'm getting my mom. She'll know what to do." No, Mrs. Willow protested weakly, reaching for his arm. "I don't need your mother meddling. I'll be fine. Just give me a day or two." Ethan looked at her, torn between respecting her wishes and doing what he knew was right. She seemed so fragile, sitting there in her oversized chair, and he couldn't shake the worry gnawing at him. "You've been so kind to me, Ethan," she said softly, her eyes meeting his. "I don't want to be a burden." "You're not a burden," Ethan said firmly. "You're my friend, and friends take care of each other." Mrs. Willow's expression wavered and she nodded reluctantly. "All right then. If it'll make you feel better, go ahead and get her." Ethan wasted no time. He sprinted home, burst through the front door, and found his mom in the kitchen, peeling potatoes. "Mom, Mrs. Willow isn't feeling well," he said out of breath. "She looks really sick. Can you come check on her?" Claire's hands froze, and she looked at Ethan with concern. "What do you mean she's sick? Is she hurt?" "I don't know," Ethan said quickly. "She's just really pale, and she said she hasn't eaten." Claire grabbed her coat and followed Ethan back to Mrs. Willow's house. When they arrived, Mrs. Willow was still in her chair, looking even weaker than before. "Mrs. Willow, I'm Claire Carter," Ethan's mom said gently as she knelt beside her. "Ethan told me you're not feeling well. May I take a look?" Mrs. Willow sighed but didn't resist as Claire checked her pulse and asked a few questions. After a few minutes, Claire stood and turned to Ethan. "She needs to see a doctor. I'll call and make an appointment for tomorrow, but in the meantime, we need to get her something to eat and make sure she stays warm." Ethan nodded, relief flooding through him. "I'll make some tea," he said, already heading for the kitchen. Over the next hour, Ethan and his mom worked together to make Mrs. Willow comfortable. Claire heated up some soup while Ethan fetched a blanket from the hall closet. Mrs. Willow protested the fussing at first, but eventually gave in, her gratitude evident in the way she squeezed Ethan's hand as he tucked the blanket around her. "You're a good boy," she said softly. "I don't deserve all this kindness." "Of course you do," Ethan replied. "You've done so much for me. It's only fair." Mrs. Willow smiled faintly and closed her eyes, leaning back against the chair. The next day, Claire drove Mrs. Willow to the doctor while Ethan was at school. When he got home, he found his mom waiting for him in the living room. "How is she?" he asked anxiously, dropping his backpack on the floor. "She's stable," Claire said reassuringly. "The doctor said it's nothing life-threatening, but she's been neglecting her health. She needs to eat better and take her medications regularly." Ethan let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. "Can I see her?" "She's resting right now," Claire said, placing a hand on his shoulder. "But I'm sure she'd love to see you tomorrow." Ethan nodded, already planning what he could bring to cheer her up. Over the next few weeks, Ethan became even more involved in helping Mrs. Willow. He made sure she ate her meals, reminded her to take her medications, and even walked to the pharmacy to pick up her prescriptions. One afternoon, as they sat in the garden, Mrs. Willow reached for Ethan's hand. "You've given me so much, Ethan," she said, her voice trembling. "Your time, your care, your friendship. I don't think I can ever repay you." "You don't have to repay me," Ethan said, his throat tightening. "You're my friend. That's all that matters." Mrs. Willow smiled, her eyes glistening. "Perhaps. But friends take care of each other, don't they?" Ethan nodded, unable to speak. He didn't know what the future held for Mrs. Willow, but he was determined to be there for her, just as she had been there for him. Unbeknownst to Ethan, Mrs. Willow had been quietly making arrangements of her own. She wanted to ensure that the boy who had brought so much light into her life would have a brighter future of his own. 3 weeks had passed since Ethan last sat in the garden with Mrs. Willow. The garden looked as beautiful as ever, with the flowers in full bloom and the pathways clear, but it felt different now. Quieter, lonelier. Mrs. Willow had passed away peacefully in her sleep just a few days after Ethan's last visit, and the small neighborhood had lost its most mysterious but beloved soul. Ethan had been heartbroken. He hadn't realized how much Mrs. Willow had come to mean to him until she was gone. She was the first real friend he had made in a long time, someone who saw him for who he was and appreciated him for it. For days after the funeral, he found himself wandering into the garden, sitting on the bench where she used to rest, and staring at the flowers they had worked so hard to revive. It was his way of holding on to her. His mother, Claire, had been worried about him. Ethan wasn't the type to openly express his grief, so she made sure to check on him often. One evening, as they ate a quiet dinner together, the doorbell rang. Claire got up to answer it, and Ethan heard muffled voices at the door. A few moments later, she returned to the table, a puzzled expression on her face. "Ethan," she said, sitting down. "That was a lawyer. He wants to meet with us tomorrow about something related to Mrs. Willow." Ethan looked up, confused. "A lawyer? Why?" Claire shook her head. "I'm not sure. He didn't say much, just that it was important and that it concerned you." The next day, Claire and Ethan drove to the lawyer's office in town. Ethan sat nervously in the passenger seat, fidgeting with the hem of his sweatshirt. He couldn't imagine what Mrs. Willow could have left for him, if anything at all. She didn't have much, and even if she did, why would she leave it to him? The lawyer, a kind-looking man with gray hair and a warm demeanor, greeted them in the lobby and led them to a small conference room. Once they were seated, he opened a folder and pulled out a neatly typed document. "Mrs. Agatha Willow named you in her will, Ethan," the lawyer said, looking at him over the rim of his glasses. "She spoke very highly of you, and wanted to ensure you were taken care of in a way that reflected the impact you had on her life." Ethan blinked, unsure if he had heard correctly. She mentioned me? In her will?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The lawyer nodded. "She did. She wanted you to know how much you meant to her in the time you spent together. She left you a sum of $10,000 to be used for your future, as well as a personal letter." Ethan's jaw dropped. He couldn't speak. His mother, sitting beside him, placed a comforting hand on his arm, equally stunned. "That's incredibly generous," Claire said softly. "I don't even know what to say." The lawyer slid an envelope across the table toward Ethan. His name was written on it in Mrs. Willow's familiar handwriting. With trembling hands, Ethan picked it up and carefully opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded neatly. He unfolded it and began to read. "Dear Ethan, you were the light in my twilight years, a beacon of kindness when I thought the world had forgotten me. You gave me companionship, laughter, and a reason to look forward to each day. For that, I am forever grateful. I don't have much to give, but I want you to have this small gift. Use it to chase your dreams, whatever they may be, whether it's for college, travel, or something else entirely. I hope it helps you build a future as bright as the heart you've shown me. The garden we worked on together. It's yours now. I've made arrangements with your mother to ensure you can continue caring for it if you wish. Treat it as a place of peace, reflection, and joy, just as it was for me. Thank you, Ethan, for everything. You were the grandson I never had, and you brought me more happiness than I can put into words. With all my love, Mrs. Agatha Willow Ethan's hands shook as he finished reading, tears streaming down his face. He looked up at his mom, who was wiping her own eyes, and then back at the lawyer. She called me her grandson, Ethan said, his voice breaking. She really thought of me like that? The lawyer smiled kindly. She did. She spoke about you often. You brought her a great deal of joy, Ethan. I think she simply wanted you to know how much you mattered to her. Ethan clutched the letter to his chest, overwhelmed by a mix of emotions. Grief, gratitude, and a deep sense of love for the woman who had changed his life in ways he was only beginning to understand. On the drive home, Claire glanced at Ethan. As he stared out the window, the letter still clutched in his lap. "What are you thinking about, sweetheart?" she asked gently. "I'm thinking about what she said in the letter," Ethan replied. "About using the money for my future. I want to save it for college. I think that's what she would have wanted." Claire smiled, her eyes shining with pride. "I think that's a wonderful idea." When they got home, Ethan went straight to the garden. He sat on the bench where Mrs. Willow had often rested and looked around at the vibrant flowers and neatly trimmed bushes. It felt like she was still there, watching over him, encouraging him to keep going, to keep growing. He took a deep breath and wiped his tears. "I'll take care of it, Mrs. Willow," he whispered. "I'll take care of the garden, and I'll take care of my future, I promise." The days that followed were bittersweet. Ethan missed Mrs. Willow terribly, but he found comfort in the garden and the memories they had created together. He spent hours tending to the flowers, pulling weeds, and making sure everything was just the way she would have wanted it. It became a place of healing for him, a reminder of the power of kindness and the impact one person can have on another's life. And though Mrs. Willow was gone, her presence lingered in every bloom, every leaf, and every ray of sunlight that filtered through the trees.